Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, May 9th edition of the Cluster API meeting as part of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a pretty full agenda today, so we're going to dive in, and we're going to start off with a recap from Chris Nova of the in-person Cluster API meeting that happened last week at KubeCon Europe. Chris, you're muted now.
Cool. Let me pull up the doc. Can we come back to me in a second? Robbie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. The doc, I linked the doc from our meeting notes for this meeting also,
Okay.
if you need a quick shortcut to get there.
Yeah. Pulling it up now. Okay. So we had a kind of an impromptu meeting that I thought was only going to be a handful of folks that turned out to be probably 20 or 30 people at the end of KubeCon. We made it a point not to decide anything, but only to discuss open agenda items and create action items to come back to the SIG. We did an unconference. The first thing we started about was the cluster API in an Arc backup, just talking about different scenarios of backing up both the cluster with the cluster API, the infrastructure layers, as well as applications on top. Andy from Heptio gave a really good talk on that, and I think there's a link further down in the doc as well that we encourage folks to check out. We also talked about the cluster registry. This was kind of a longer issue for us, and we decided that it would make sense to take some sort of action item to ping the multi-cluster folks and just let them know that we're both working on cluster definitions and start to figure out what that boundary looks like as a group. I think those are the two big ones. We talked about bare metal a little bit, but nothing concrete came out of it other than it's going to be interesting and we kind of have our work cut out for us. Did I miss anything else? Anybody else who was there? I think another issue that was probably important to bring up. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I forget who it was, but somebody had loosely committed to trying to help us get these to a stable tag of the API as well in the new repository. But I think we can probably dive more into that as we go through the nitty-gritty of what you guys have been working on. I haven't been here in the past couple of weeks, so still playing catch up. And I think that is the only update for the KubeCon meeting.
Great, thanks. Is anybody else who was there want to chime in, add any more details, or? All right, okay, we'll move on to the next one. I just added this to the agenda. We brought this up last week, Chris, but you weren't here. You have a PR out to delete a whole bunch of old code from the KubeDeploy repo, sort of to finish the migration over the cluster API repo. I think we just wanted to check in on status of that. I guess you said you've been out for a little bit, but you said that 8 days ago, and it would be nice to get that in and clean up the KubeDeploy repo.
I totally agree. I kind of just opened that up to get the ball rolling. My plan of attack went there was to make the old directory a Git submodule, so that way anybody who's still vendoring KubeDeploy could potentially check that submodule out and should get at least a relatively close copy of code, just to sort of preserve a little bit of backwards compatibility. But if nobody else has any issues there and the code change looks good, I'm okay with it. I think it's a good idea to get that code out of there. I really want us to have one sort of source of truth here.
Do you think this would be a good forum to ask people if they would prefer a Git submodule versus straight deletion? I mean, people who are vendoring, if they're updating their vendor dependencies, is it easier or just as easy to update to the new location for vendor dependencies as it is to deal with any changes that might come as from the Git submodule?
From KubeCon's perspective, the Git submodule is irrelevant. We're just going to do one fell swoop and change over. I don't know about other folks though, but I figured it would be a good idea.
It's pretty low maintenance to leave it in there, right? It's a very small file, so it's not a big deal to put it in there.
Okay.
Devin says it might be best to just break people.
Yeah, if there's any possibility of somebody getting stuck on something they didn't intend or not realizing that something moved, I know submodules can be a little tricky.
Okay.
+1 on breaking.
I will update my PR then, and I will just RMRF the whole directory.
Excellent. Feng, you've got the next item on the agenda.
Okay, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the Tencent team and also Ziguo from the Tencent team to the community. So Tencent is joining our class API effort. So as a first step, they will work on to bring the provider support for the Tencent cloud specifically. Ziguo, are you online? Can you present self-introduction for yourself and connect with Tencent community?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. But it seems I cannot make my face visible on the panel. It is the first time I use the Zoom.
It looks like it's showing a picture that maybe implies that your camera is not working correctly. We can hear you just fine now.
Okay. I'm very glad to join the project and to work with you together.
Welcome. We're very excited to have you.
This is 1 a.m. in Beijing, so it's a very, very inconvenient time for Ziguo. But thank you for joining.
It's okay.
Yeah, the meeting was set, I think, more to be Europe friendly than to be China friendly, unfortunately. All right, Jessica, are you on the line? You've got the next agenda item.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, I'm looking through the list of people. It's so long. Go ahead.
All right. So I wanted to bring up that since we have the deployer in branch, the GCP deployer in the future cluster CTL, when there are changes that require an image update, the deployer becomes broken between the merging of the code and the update of the image. And so I wanted to propose some kind of policy and process until we have automation to take care of making sure images are up to date. So my straw man for our process until we have automation is that if people are making changes that will require image updates, they should make sure that the contributions work with at least one provider. And then we should have some way to give a heads up to people who own the various providers to update images. And we should merge only Monday through Thursday so that the deployer doesn't break and stay broken over the weekend. Does that seem reasonable, or do we understand the issue?
Yeah, I think it's really reasonable.
Okay, sounds good then.
I don't hear any objections. If people want to give like a thumbs up, thumbs down real quick, if people don't want to talk, or type it in the chat so we can get some consensus and move forward.
Yeah, it sounds good to me. It's kind of a commitment for me to talk. I have to like restart some audio drivers on my end because Linux, so I'll be kind of signaling whenever possible.
Excellent, thanks.
Is this just in response to there not being adequate testing in place? Is that that's the
Yeah, so in the future, ideally, we have the automation to have the end-to-end test to validate the deployers, as well as to update images when people check in changes that require an image bump. But we don't have that now, and it'd be great not to leave the deployers broken for long periods of time. So just some process in the interim.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Great. Zen, you're up next. Cluster API validation.
Hello, everyone. So I'm John from Google, and shall I present the code? So can everyone see this?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, all right. So this proposal is about adding some sort of validation functionality to this cluster API tool. So what does is basically checking whether the cluster and machines and the system is working correctly. For example, like whether those master components are ready and healthy, whether those like cluster API stack are functioning. It's a little different from the performance tests, because this is like a step before that, I think. For example, if API server is not working properly, we cannot run performance test anyway. And this will provide some hints, okay, now you have API server not working, and you should check that. So it's a way to help the developers or anyone to understand what's happening on the cluster and if it's functioning as expected. So this proposal is about adding a top-level comment like cluster CTL validate cluster as a way to run this. And so if we are okay with adding this, then there will be some questions of how are we going to do it, like on the client side or on the server side. But before that, I just want to gather some feedback from everyone, to see whether people are thinking this is interesting and helpful, and we should do it.
I think this, in general, this crosses over into the status of the machine realm a little bit, which is where do we draw the line between the piece of software that's going to be continually checking the status of our machines, ensuring that they're healthy, and then this overall concept of a healthy cluster. So for instance, we could have all of our machines registering okay, and then something is still going on in the cluster, and then this validation would fail. What are the boundaries there, and how do those two things fit together?
Right now, I'm thinking about this as a command line tool instead of some components running in the, like on the master. So there could be something there actually, because for example, if we are creating a cluster, if we want to wait until the cluster is ready, and then we will have some components running in the controller manager or machine manager to make sure okay everything is working correctly. And we will need some functionality there, but then I'm not sure whether we actually should also check whether those components are working correctly. Otherwise, those are how are we going to make sure like those are working?
I guess my question here is are we introducing a new piece of server-side software other than the controller that's going to be responsible for checking the health of our infrastructure? Or are we just going to only depend on the controller code, and the command line tool is just a thin wrapper that just checks status and says everything's okay?
I see. Okay. So I would rather actually share code with anything like in controller manager or machine manager already there. And so I think that's actually lead to the question like here, like say whether we should do it in client side or server side actually. So I think if we can actually do, I would actually to do most of the stuff on the server side as many as possible, mostly because a lot of things running there will also require some sort of validation functionality. So we can share the functionality there. But then there will be some part I think cannot be done on server side, like checking the controller manager itself is working, can only be done on the client side and to call the APIs. And that part, I guess, should be living in the client side. So ideally, maybe it will be a mix of the both work, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think having the mix is important. And I think coming up a layer above the controller and checking the status of the controller is also important. I would be wary of introducing new code that's independent of the controller that does the same kind of validation that we're kind of also expecting the controller to have.
Yeah,
I would almost rather see like a section of the controller code that has a validation step in the broader loop.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that line. Yeah, I'm thinking about like the controller manager will share the validation code there.
For those of us that aren't familiar, you mentioned here it's very similar to kops validate cluster. Could you or Justin or someone who's familiar with that talk about what kops validate cluster is, what the use case for that is, and sort of how people use it in practice?
Yeah, so
I mean, I can certainly jump in. Go on. Well, I was just gonna say, so kops validate cluster is a little tool that basically checks a similar sort of thing, that the cluster is basically ready. We don't currently have a wait option. I think we should, but so currently it exits like ready or not ready. And I think people typically wrap it in a loop and will, when they're using automated tooling to build clusters, will effectively use it to gate moving on in their deployment procedure or their update procedure. We also embed the logic in our rolling update. So after we shut down each machine, we actually wait for the cluster to be fully healthy in between before we do the next one.
And does it have a similar notion of what fully healthy means to what Zen is describing here?
It has a very similar notion, yes. This is what Zen is describing is probably better, but yes. So currently the COPS has a sort of less clear layering of infrastructure or not. So COPS validate cluster goes and like talks to the cloud provider APIs. And it looks like this is implementable without having to do that if the controller is publishing appropriate status or whatever it is, which I think would be much better. Yeah.
So is the objective then, I mean, is the broader objective to make sure basically that the controller manager is operational? And are there other pieces that need to be validated from the client side?
I think in the long term, I think it will be broader than that. So I think the general idea is to making sure things are working correctly. That does not just include the controller manager. It will include everything. So in the matter, we think we should actually validate the network or the firewalls are working correctly. Those can be added gradually, I think. So I'm just thinking about this cluster CTL validate will be something we can expand gradually. Like right now, we're just checking the cluster and nodes and machines are working correctly and the core components are working correctly. But later, we can potentially add more there. And then it will be extensible. I hope that will be something we can continue to do.
I mean, I guess what I would say my concern here is that then if you're pushing a lot of logic down to the client, it assumes that you're always using cluster CTL. And that may not be the case. So if I were implementing this, like if I want to basically if I want to ensure as the first use case, like that the controller manager was up and operational or doing the things that I would want it to do, I would almost probably implement this as an additional process or like a sidecar process that's ensuring that those things are up and functional.
I see.
But I'm a bit, like, it concerns me a bit that we would be pushing more and more logic down into the client.
I'm right now thinking about to have some sort of functionality on the client side to check the minimum requirements are working, like the controller manager are working, and then we can talk to the cluster. And then once we can talk to the cluster and get status from the controller manager, then we can rely on controller manager to do more things.
And maybe the same code, if we build it in a modular way, could be like used in other places. There is a sort of driving use case that pops, by the way, which is the classic failure mode is that you don't have quota or sufficient quota to launch your machines, or an instance type is not available because AWS has run out in a particular region. And at least with COPS, we're sort of asynchronous creation. And it's very difficult for a user to know when the cluster doesn't appear 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes later that what has gone wrong. And like that is this COPS validate cluster is a very helpful point to add logic to give users, I think.
Yeah. And
we can't do that in
like
the
desired state versus actual state in like a deployment, right?
And also, if we think about this more concretely, we can think about, okay, we need to check some of the master components from client side to make sure, okay, master components are working. And then once we pass that point, everything else can be done by the controller manager.
So would that be an extension of cluster health? So kubectl get cluster health, or what's the command actually? Because there is some commands like that, right?
Well, can you clarify that a little bit? What do you mean?
Because there is the command, the kubectl command cluster health, which already checks for etcd and I think some other things. API server and controller manager.
I think you mean kubectl get component status.
Oh yeah, yeah, yes, like that, yeah.
Yeah,
so there are
sorry.
some of those already, yeah. So basically, like it's, yeah, I think anyone can just run kubectl, get nodes, get component status, and get like system, a kube system ports, for example. Yeah, any developer can do that. So it's a matter of whether we want to make this as a. So I guess the benefit is like, so first of all, it's like easy to use to just run one command and then check everything, and then we can just include those as like the bare minimum, and then more things are done on the controller.
And I think maybe that's addressing Craig's concern about where the logic lives. If the logic is really, it's doing things you could all do by hand, but sort of doing it with one command and sort of pre-printing or formatting that output to make it easier for you to understand what might not be working, then that's not adding additional logic that we should have on the server side. It's just sort of tying together server-side logic in a way that maybe makes it easier for humans to consume.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I will also point out that get component status is a lot of folks are trying to deprecate and get rid of that API endpoint. So we should think about what happens when we get
I think. Okay, so does this mean this seems okay and I should just go ahead to look into more detail?
I mean, I think it's an interesting idea to bring up, and I think we should be talking about the status of the bits of infrastructure and how we make sense of them. Like Robbie said, how we amalgamate that together. As far as implementation into the tool goes, I think we should just follow standard protocol and open up a small concrete issue around what that would look like technically and go from there.
Okay, sounds good. All right.
In addition to that, there is the stock that Zen has been presenting that if folks are interested in sort of the scope of this tool and what its responsibilities would be, please go take a look at that and add comments. Because if we open a small issue, it's almost certainly going to link to the doc where there'll be lots of details. And the more agreement that we get on that end state before we start spending time writing code, the better, because then we're not crashing later. All right, Kenny, you're next.
Unfortunately, I don't think Kenny has a mic, so he wanted me to just talk a little bit about this.
Perfect.
He is taking a first pass at the machine deployments implementation, and he would just like to put that out there and make sure everyone gets some eyes on it so he gets a lot of good feedback on it. That's pretty much the crux of that bullet point.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. Other Chris. All right. Chris Nova says, can I demo the cluster API plus KubeCon work on AWS in the future? And I think the answer is yes. How soon do you want to demo?
I could demo, I mean, like next week if we wanted to. But I think before we schedule it, I kind of also just wanted to paint the picture of why I did what I did and how this relates to the cluster CTL tooling, which was I wrote a completely vanilla implementation from scratch, explicitly not using the common code in the repo as it stands today, in the hopes of proving and disproving different patterns along the way. So something I would kind of want folks to kind of be aware of when we do demo it is to be mindful of the similarities and differences between the two so that we can talk about them more as we start to write cluster CTL. But yeah, if I can demo it next week, I think that would be cool.
I think that'd be great. Let's put you on the agenda for the first part. And if you can keep the demo to say like 20 to 30 minutes maximum, that'd be great. So that leaves us time to have the discussion as well afterwards.
Okay.
All right, so you also have a question about updating Cloud Provider, Cloud Provider of the repo.
Yeah, I've had a few folks come up to me, both at KubeCon and like in the wild, Slack and Twitter and stuff, wondering what the situation is with Cloud Provider and the Cluster API repo. And then I think more importantly, they were looking for the story of how we're going to pull it out and what the interface between the two is going to be like moving forward. So I don't know if we have plans for that, but if we don't have plans and that is something that we agree on as a working group or a sub-project, I think we should probably start that effort.
Chris or Jessica, do you guys have any context on this? I don't know where we're at on this one.
When I moved the repos over, I initially didn't move any of the provider stuff over, and I got a little pushback that there wasn't really a plan around how we were going to manage that. And the original task was just to move everything over to the new repo. As far as going forward with this, we need to figure out how we want to support multiple repos and the testing scenario, and like how do we validate cluster API changes like end to end without a provider, or do we do a set of providers? There's a lot of issues regarding this, and we just haven't really talked about it because we've been focused on getting the core stuff stable and working. Jess, do you want to add anything to that, or Chris?
My thought here would be to follow suit with the migration itself, and start with an umbrella issue and start to call out the steps needed to make this happen and call out any blockers or decision points along the way. And we can kind of go from there. But I mean, I think if this is something that we want to do, like I've heard both, it's a good idea and a bad idea. I know Tim St. Clair kind of gave us some pushback on moving cloud providers out in the first place. So maybe even beg the question of, should we just open up the issue in general and let folks kind of look at that for, you know, a week or two before we even start the umbrella issue.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is and we had some similar conversations at the contributor meetup before KubeCon in Austin about moving things around, and some people I think came in, and this was related to core Kubernetes. Some people came in with the assumption that of course we want to do X, and then when you actually start asking everyone about it, there's a lot of pushback to saying like, actually that's probably not a good idea. We probably aren't going to make our development any faster or easier or better. So just sort of putting it out there as like, maybe we came in with the assumption that, you know, obviously we'd want to split the cloud provider code out. Is that actually the right path forward? Do people have strong opinions one way or the other, or, you know, good rationale maybe why we should keep it in there? How would you propose we gather that input? I think, you know, we can create an issue and ask people to comment on it. Getting it in front of the right sort of folks is, I think, the important part there.
I think starting with an issue, we can do the +1 thumbs up, thumbs down voting system if we want, and then just ask for feedback, and then maybe kick off an email to the broader SIG and gently nudge stakeholders along the way.
Okay, we can also mention it during the main SIG meeting next week for people that may not attend this one, and ask them to look at that issue and comment if they have strong opinions.
Okay, I can take ownership of these things.
Okay, that'd be great.
This is for the code that's under Cluster API Cloud. That's what we're talking about. So Google and Terraform right now.
Yeah.
And can anyone like TLDR on the reasons why people want it out of the repo?
So that we're not advertising this implementation is the blessed implementation by the community, but rather advertising the API patterns as a whole.
That's what I figured. Does it? I mean, would a simple solution perhaps be something like move it from cloud to just like contrib, and that, you know, kind of gives a signal that these are reference implementations for these particular cloud providers?
I think that's. I mean, if we are going to keep it in, I would vote for a pattern like that. And I would even encourage us to try to get at least one cloud provider with multiple implementations.
Can I also suggest that if we open an issue, we guide people in a certain way? So we say like, please put your use cases and why you want them out of tree here, rather than being like a just general voting type of scenario.
Yeah. And we probably ought to also drop in a friendly reminder that this cloud provider is inherently different than the broader upstream cloud provider, because I know this has been a hot button recently.
Chris, how do you propose we get somebody to write more than one implementation for a cloud? It seems like it's going to almost have to be sort of two different authors, because one person isn't likely to have motivation to rewrite all the code twice, or it's not essentially different either.
So in KubeCon and in COPS, we have public and private topology in AWS. I think this is a really great example of how you would reconcile infrastructure differently, but defined the same way in the same cloud provider. And as far as authorship goes, I mean, we can cross that bridge when it comes.
Excellent. All right, and thank you for taking the action item to drive this forward. We expect to see more in the next couple weeks.
Okay, I'll add myself as a little comment here.
Thanks. And we have one more agenda item, so if you guys have other things you want to talk about, please add it to the end. We have a few more minutes. And in the meantime, Cesar, you've got one about provider config validation.
Yeah, so this is more basic than the validation we were talking about before. The cluster uses. How do I ensure that the provider config that I'm submitting to the API server is validly formed? And so right now, if I want to use the API server image, I don't have a way for it to, a way to modify it to validate a specific cloud provider, right? And I'm not sure what would be a good pattern to support that. Just looking for ideas.
So as far as validating provider config embedded in machine and cluster objects, that's just a runtime.raw extension, and I don't have a good story for how to validate that, but I believe a while back Robbie made a change and someone made a similar change in the cluster object to have it also be able to point to a different API endpoint or API type, and you could register a CRD that has CRD-based validation. Do it that way if you really wanted. And then when your machine controller, when you go to create that API type, the validation could fail there. For the embedded, the best story I can come up with is when your machine controller sees it and tries to parse it, punt back a error status in the machine status somewhere saying invalid provider config with validation errors. It's not a great story, but I'm open to ideas on how to make that part better.
So what about an admission control, a binary admission controller that would intercept it in the API server? Thoughts?
Maybe. I don't know enough about that to be able to say whether that's a good idea or not.
Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, so if there's an API resource that represents that provider config, so there's a CRD defined, or there's another API server that knows how to handle those types of objects. Could the cluster API server call out to those for an embedded provider config? Just thinking of options, and I don't know how good that that other idea would be.
I'm not sure how that could work, but if you register a CRD with the API server and it shows up in that API server scheme, I guess there could be validation logic that would try to parse the API version and type out of the embedded, see if it knows about it, and then run validation on that. You're welcome to try to prototype something like that. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
We should probably ask API machinery what their thoughts are here. Like, tell them what we're doing, and like I know they're doing server-side validation for CRD, or that's coming.
1.11, yes.
Pardon me?
1.11 has server-side validation for CRDs, at least planned. I think for API extensions, it should already work.
Yeah, so it's just, does it work inside a raw object, and is there a way we can tell it to?
I think our problem is that we have like sub-objects, right? Or if I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
Could we split that up into 2 CRDs? That's how we do it at GiantSwarm, for example, but we have a very different architecture. So
I think that's kind of what Chris was saying is I'd sent a PR a little while back that I need to follow up on to add a concept called machine classes, which is basically instead of embedding the provider config, you provide a reference to it. And then if you're providing a reference to it, when you create the machine class itself, you could apply that validation to it. And then the reference just has to be a valid reference at that point. So then the question is, if we support both models, embedded and referential, it would be nice to also be able to do some validation on the embedded form as well.
So I'm not sure if that might be coming similar to how like pod spec is part of deployment spec. I might have heard something on KubeCon about that, but I'm not really sure.
Do you know who you might have heard that from? Somebody mentioned we should follow up with the API machinery.
I think
team.
API machinery, yeah.
That'd be the same question for them.
Yeah.
Does someone want to take the action item to find a friendly face in API machinery and start asking some of these questions?
I can take the to-do.
Great, thank you. All right, does anybody else have any other agenda items they'd like to discuss? Going once, going twice. All right, we'll give everybody 20 minutes back and hope to see everyone again next week. Thank you for joining. Have a good day.